afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. I've interacted with a number of Australians at programs that Singularity Universities run. It's an exciting time for me to come to Sydney for the first time, especially as I've recently moved to New Zealand, so I feel like I'm kind of in the neighborhood. I've been asked to give you one piece of housekeeping advice, which is you have your apps, those of you who've downloaded them. The way that you ask questions, either of Kyla or of me, is to submit questions in the app, and then the moderator will work through those questions with us after the talk. So while I've met a few people from this country, and while I track a few different companies that come from Australia, I don't really know much about the ecosystem, much about the Singularity University community here. And I don't know, for instance, in this room, what percentage of your enthusiasm for being here comes from a desire to learn about new technologies that might give you some kind of competitive edge, or just be really impressive within your professional ecosystem, and what percentage of the enthusiasm comes from a desire to solve major problems in the world with these technologies. Fortunately, Singularity invests in partnerships and in projects that are trying to tackle major global grand challenges like hunger, like poverty, like access to education and healthcare. But I want to start off by talking to you a little bit about the failed, where technology isn't really living up to its promise so far. I've started to collect quotations that take this shape. When you have somebody in a position of leadership, somebody very well informed, somebody with incredible perspective in their day and age, regardless of their industry or their nation, who's very excitedly pronouncing that suddenly we can solve all the problems. We now have all the tools to solve all the problems, like that the problem before was we didn't have the tools. Now, obviously, all of these people have to be wrong because it wasn't the first time, but I think all of these people in some ways were also right. Back in 1960, it wasn't technologically or mathematically impossible to feed the world and to improve global health and to have a better approach to energy and so forth, but we didn't do it at the time. So we keep having these beautiful images of a future society enabled with technology shown to us by our designers, by our architects, by our artists, and it looks so clean. The planet and technology are all in harmony with one another. There's not a speck of poverty. It's bright, it's green. But that's not the target that we're hitting, right? This is today's city. We have lots of cities that are growing really fast right now, million-person cities popping up frequently in countries that you may not be tracking very closely. And that urban planning isn't being done well. That rapid urbanization, it's not coming along looking like the screen before. This is Mumbai, but it could be Sao Paulo, it could be Johannesburg, it could be Dhaka, right? And we're not really hitting the mark with this. The World Economic Forum called income inequality the #1 trend of 2015, and since then they've been tracking it closely, and just last week they released a really concerning report digging deeper into where we're failing on the issue of inequality. But let's look at the scale of this. One of the things that I like to do, just to gauge how much a room is kind of tracking the scale of the problem, is ask this question. So we're coming close to 8 billion people, we're over 7.5 billion people, we're about that many people on Earth. How many of us are living on less than $5 a day? Now, I'm not going to be able to see your hands too well, but you'll be able to get a sense of where you are. So if you think there's 1.5 billion people on the planet who live on less than $5 a day, go ahead and raise your hand. Raise it high so we can see if there's anybody in this category. I see very few. If you think it's about 2 billion people, go ahead and raise your hand. I'm seeing maybe 10% of the room's raising their hand. If you think 3 billion people, that looks like it got about 40% of you. And if you think it's 4 billion of us, it's a little over half. Yeah, and I think the last two numbers had most of the room. It is 4 billion. That's where we're at. 4 billion people on the planet. More than half of us are living on less than $5 a day. And a lot of the time when I give that answer to people, there's often some head shaking and some gasping, and people are sometimes quite surprised by that. And certainly still the majority of us, or at least 40% of us, were getting that wrong. And I think that that's because our global discourse, and especially our statistical discourse about poverty, is misleading. We set the global poverty line at $1.90 a day. So if you make $2 a day, you're not falling into that category of poverty that we like to celebrate ourselves for removing you from. Now, I don't know about you. I don't know if you think that there are countries that people can live just fine on even $5 a day. You might think, oh yeah, I've been to some pretty poor countries, $5 might cut it. But you probably wouldn't think that that $5 is enough for the family or the person who has like an accident, something bad happened to them. They get sick, a child gets sick, a storm comes through, wipes out the things that they use. You know that at $5 a day, it's not like you have a piggy bank full of resilience, right? These are people that can fall into poverty and debt traps of poverty that in some countries are literally passed from one generation to another. One of the reasons why I think we're kind of comfortable with the level of poverty that there is, or comfortable remaining relatively inactive about it, is not just statistical manipulation. It's because we think that it's a solved problem. There's been a lot of backpatting over the last 4 or 5 years, like headline articles about, oh, you know, the global poverty, we've got it, we fixed it. So aside from the fact that we set the number really low, we have been moving the goalposts around a little bit. There's some analysis going on in the statistical arena that doesn't have the most integrity. And if you're interested in really getting into that, this book is fantastic. Jason Hickel is a professor at the London School of Economics, very well placed, right at the center of some of the biggest international aid and development organizations to look through timely data and point out that maybe we are in fact losing ground. Just in the last several years, some of the progress that we've been touting, some of the things that looked like trends, they're not behaving like trends. They stalled, they might be rolling back a little bit on hunger, on poverty. If that's happening, there's some messages that we need to pay attention to. There's a different type of approach to innovations that we might want to consider. And another reason that people decide that maybe this isn't their area to care a lot about is they think there's always been inequality. Inequality is not inherently bad, right? Maybe they think they're better than someone else or more deserving than someone else or their country works harder than someone else, and they think it's not that bad. Maybe even it's healthy and motivating. That's why this study and the series of studies that preceded it and followed it really caught my attention. Because what it found, one of the most incendiary findings, was in fact that within this neighborhood, kids from poorer, less educated families actually had thinner regions of the prefrontal cortex than children from better off families. This does not map to whatever prejudice you might have in your head. This isn't like racially done, gender done. There's no other thing than that relatively within this neighborhood, the poorer kids had less money than the wealthy kids. And it actually impacted their neurological development in a way that could cause lasting disadvantage. Right? That means working on inequality is a public health initiative, a public health intervention. It's a human rights issue. We also know that inequality, income inequality in particular, correlates with crime, with shorter lifespans, with stress. We know that everything to do with the environment gets better where you have income equality. And so where in all of this is technology? We've got these amazing technologies. We've got some of the things I just spoke about. It always makes me wonder, like, why has humanity been failing to deliver on the promise of technology for so many years? First quote I showed you is 1961, right? And then in the 80s and on and on. And I want to give you, 4 or 5 seconds to just hear your brain answer that question to yourself. Why has humanity failed for so many years to deliver on the promises of technology? The reason I like people to hear their answers to that is because I think it's a particularly good question for revealing biases that you might have. One of the popular answers that I hear just blames us. It says we're either, by virtue of our environment and our genetics or our spiritual nature, we're bad. We're selfish, we're corrupt, we're greedy. You can't expect anything better from us, we're bad animals. Some people don't buy that at all, but they will apply it to power. They'll say, our governments are bad. It's that our governments suck, and people, once they get up to that level, they become bad. Power corrupts them, and then that's the problem. Other people look at those trying to help, and they say, NGOs, nonprofits, these people, they're inefficient. They don't know what they're doing. They waste all our money. They waste all our social capital. Or you look at companies, and you're like, oh, they're wrecking the world. They're predatory and rapacious and extractive. But I think the best answer that I've generally heard to this is that we have bad processes. It's not that we lack resources. It's not even that we lack intentions that are good, but our processes aren't really delivering on this one for us. So I want to be talking about processes that might help us do a little better, but I want to start with some provocations about the status quo. I've done a lot of work in educational technologies. I have a background in education and classroom teaching and technology-facilitated teaching and so forth. So I like to track that arena. If you've looked into it too, you might remember, I don't know, maybe 6 years ago, MOOCs, massive open online courses, were going to educate everybody, change the world, everything was going to be fine. 5 years before that, everything was going to be fine. When radio was first invented, it was going to make everything fine. We thought technology would solve education for a long time. Here's an analyst situated right in the middle of Silicon Valley with access to all of these technologies, looking very closely at them and saying that one of the most notable findings he had is that when you bring information and communication technologies into the school, it will exacerbate, it will amplify whatever inequality is there. That's not just tech failing to deliver on a promise. That is it actively breaking that promise and making it worse. Not in a good school, not in a place where there wasn't much inequality, where it was pretty all right. There, it went up. But in a school that had this spectrum, the technology amplified the inequality. If that kind of gets your brain going and you want to dig into that a little bit more, within the context of educational technologies, you can read Geek, Heresy by Kentaro Toyama. If you're an educator, it's definitely worth having a look at that book. Just 3 years old, but it's aging well. Automating Inequality was published just 3 weeks ago, and that takes a very close look at what algorithms and machine learning are doing when we're not paying close attention to encode prejudice, to encode privilege in these new technologies that we're spinning out. Because when we aren't paying attention to our processes, it's quite likely that we encode things within our technologies, within our systems, that are actually not in service to all of us. Let's look at what it looks like when we kind of do this. So Uber and Airbnb, most of the time at a tech conference, when these slides are up there, I would be saying lovely things about both of these companies. I'd be telling you about how they democratize things, about how they help with sharing, how they help with collaboration, how they grow exponentially, both in terms of their revenue and their users. And they do enable people to monetize their labor and their belongings with relative convenience. But they do so at the cost of a massive centralization of wealth and power and potentially sensitive data into a very small number of hands. They do so in a way that can enable or even create new forms of discrimination. They do so in a way that is often explicitly opposed to democratically elected governments, to regulators, to citizenries. Their own laborers don't have any say in the policies or the pricing that directly affects their livelihoods. And in many cases, those same people are directly in the crosshairs of automation. So there's no illusion that there's some kind of loyalty to those people. And those companies were doing exactly what they were designed to do. They were operating in accordance with this badly photoshopped quote by Gandhi. They had a change. It was a cool change. They wanted to own it. And they're owning the crap out of it right now. For some people, it's not obvious that I photoshopped that last slide, that that's not what Gandhi would have said or did say. What I'm going to be talking about for the rest of this is a concept called ownership design. And I hope that it gives you an opportunity to pause when you or your team or people in your network are getting really excited about owning the change that they want to see in the world, and realize, like, what's the opportunity that they're missing at that moment? What type of leader are they deciding not to be? So ownership design, it's a term, as far as I can tell, a scholar by the name of Nathan Schneider brought this term into the vernacular. He maintains this website called the Internet of Ownership, which I encourage you to check out, because it basically tracks all of these new companies that are bubbling up, that are platforms. They're digital platform companies, but fundamental to how they operate is a different approach to ownership. Now, a lot of us know, if you've ever heard people pitching startups, and they're like, we're going to create a new social network or a new search engine, we're like, yeah, that doesn't even sound remotely realistic anymore. The incumbents in so many of these areas have 2 decades of network effects, data, war chests worth of capital, lawyers, everything they need to absolutely demolish you if you come at them toe-to-toe with the same business paradigm that they were built within. Right? They've got that on lockdown. So what does it look like to kind of bubble up underneath that with a different approach? One of the most interesting, let's say, applications of ownership design, one of the most interesting templates of ownership design is the Platform Cooperative. It's a type of business that's only 4 years old, maybe 3 years and 10 months or something like that. And these are a direct result of the incredible increase in the price performance power of computing, that drop and that democratization of technology. Because if you had kind of a ragtag group of drivers or weavers or people that were just in handicrafts 10 or 15 years ago that were going to say, we're going to create our own digital marketplace, sell things back and forth to our users, track their reviews, do all of that, that would not have been feasible. without raising some kind of outrageous amount of venture capital. The engineering talent, the talent with regards to database architecture, the server space alone, all of those things made that impossible. That's why those things were heavily capitalized and had the business models that they do. But because of computing getting more affordable, and because of teams building tools that are more accessible, you can now create a platform to support all types of different businesses. So if you're in Germany and you don't really want to support eBay, you don't want to go and buy something when a portion of your transaction further enriches the eBay mafia, who are already billionaires, leaves the money from your economy, and then gives the merchant as little as possible, you might go on to Fairmondo, because all of the people selling and transacting on Fairmondo own and control the platform. They make decisions democratically about how to evolve and improve it, and they have a really great attitude about what they've built. They're happy for folks in other countries to basically take their code, take their brand, and run with it. Not a franchise where they're tithing back to the emperor, but they get to copy and paste this idea and use it as a vehicle for transformative democratic change where they were. Stocksy is another platform cooperative that gets spoken about because it's been quite successful. A bunch of photographers who were tired of putting their images up on sites like Flickr and getting the bare minimum that they could have, built their own marketplace to share their wares, and they're now getting much better paid for it. And I found it interesting, the third annual Platform Cooperative event happened in November in New York last year, and we were starting to see platform cooperatives in places that we didn't traditionally think of as marketplaces, amongst people that weren't typically thought of as producers or even in like a microeconomy. So Savy considers itself a marketplace for patient insight. And what it is a bunch of patients, medical patients dealing with difficult regimes of drugs, coming together and kind of monetizing the data that they have about the experience that they're going through, and finding allied companies in the medical space that want to be more patient-centric. They want to distinguish themselves by being patient-centric. So those two fit very well together. The companies that want to be recognized for that and the people that are trying to improve the course of treatment that others go through have now built themselves this technological location where they can exchange value in multiple different ways. This site popped up about a year and a half ago. I show it just because it's already become a service. Now you could have a group of people and you could be like, well, you know, we're a small farm cooperative in this state, and we're not all that technologically savvy, but we like the idea of what you're talking about. Well, you can bring these guys in and they'll configure a platform cooperative for you. Right? This is already now just 2.5 years in, and it's being offered as a service. I looked around to see what is happening in Australia in this regard, and there's some folks in Bendigo, about 850 Ks from here, right? They're looking to set up at a municipal level, a pretty full stack platform cooperative that helps to keep a lot of the money from the transactions and from the economic activities of Bendigo there, instead of it being spent on big box stores and stuff that just go outward. Right? So it's already bubbling away. They're interested in being contacted by other people who are intrigued by the idea in the ecosystem. And I thought that was kind of one of the newer examples of a municipality exploring its own, let's say, data and software sovereignty. And then just a few days before this event, a big controversy bubbled up amongst the people who are thought leaders and technological leaders in this space. Because this company, Digital Town, who are publicly traded, they saw this and they're like, oh, okay, that's very disruptive in a very different and unusual way. There are probably going to be municipalities that want to claim the economic space that Airbnb or Uber are removing from them. And so they say they empower cities to be all at the same time, the Uber, Airbnb, Expedia, Amazon, etc. Like they have 7 different platforms. They say, we'll do this for you, city. They've already got Dallas and Austin on board. I would never have thought that this would first have taken off in 2 Texan cities, maybe Austin, not Dallas. And supposedly they've got London and Seattle in the queue. These are huge cities. These are massive economies the size of small countries' economies, that are opting for a service provided by a public company that is going to give them sovereignty and control, relatively, over the tech stack that they use. You might not be surprised if you're following the news around blockchain, that there is a blockchain angle to what they do, and that they hope to tokenize an element of this, to airdrop or sell tokens to businesses and citizens to help facilitate this type of exchange. This is fascinating to me, whether this company does it well or not, as proof of concept. I've been talking about platform cooperatives for like 3.5 years. There was no private company realizing the opportunity, reporting to shareholders, and then like popularizing this at a really serious municipal level. And I think that part of what's going on is well encapsulated by the founder of Coinbase, who said that in the next 10 years, we're going to learn more about governance than we have in the last 100 years. And the first time I heard this, I was kind of resistant to the idea. It sounded kind of boastful, and I didn't like it. But the more I sit and I watch people that are trying to launch their new currency, their new token, their new decentralized cooperative of X or Y, the more I realize that the generation of technologists that are coming up right now are going to be more governance literate than like any group of people previously. And fortunately, the type of governance literacy that they are themselves cultivating is one that they have a vested interest in spreading around. Their systems, what they're building, works when that governance literacy is spread around, when the expectation is created in rooms full of people that they have more stake in government. And this is really, really timely, because the World Bank just reported at the end of 2017 that in the last 25 years, the global average voter turnout has dropped by 10%. The last quarter century, 10%, going from probably a B to a C or a C to a D, right? We drop that much as a planet in even opting in to our democratic processes. Some places, some regions, you can see dropping even more remarkably. And against that backdrop, for the first time in a decade, very worrying from my point of view, we had the first year where we had a rollback in transparency at a government level. So this idea that we have this governance innovation starting to bubble up against this backdrop of a kind of sclerotic, unhealthy approach to democracy is another one of these kind of two ideas to hold in your head at the same time. What are some of the approaches that might appropriately rekindle in us a trust in and an interest in democracy? One of the social and sometimes digital technologies that has a lot of merit is participatory budgeting. And as I describe that for you in the next minute or two, if you think that you want to learn more about it, the book on the left, just in the first 2 chapters, you don't need to read the rest of it, effectively summarizes 20 years worth of research around the world, really, really instructive. My 2 examples that I like the most about participatory budgeting come from very different parts of the world. The Democratic Republic of Congo is the first one. So the picture in the upper right-hand corner of this slide is a bunch of feature phones and dumb phones that were used by the Open Democratic Technology Alliance to run a 4-year pilot program in Kivu, a part of Congo. Congo's already a hard place to operate. Kivu's a hard place within a hard place to operate. And these simple phones were being used to allow the citizens to decide where the money of Kivu, of the municipality, of the state, where it would be spent. So in this 4-year pilot program, the citizens of Kivu decided to build 54 classrooms, several health clinics, a new sewage system, a bunch of improvements to their roads. That's all fine and well, maybe kind of predictable. What blew my mind was that they saw a voluntary 16-fold increase in tax collection over that same period. So if you've been to an environment like the Democratic Republic of Congo, you might be aware that it's easier than here to dodge a tax collector. The state might not be that aware of all the people in the area, what they're doing, what their businesses are making, how much was really profit or not. When the citizens are coming in and being like, yeah, we have 16 times more money than we told you, and they're doing that of their own volition because you let them decide where the money goes, you are being told how to make democracy work for people. And it's not just there, it's also working really impressively in New York City. So this graph here, this elegant user interface rather, is in Long Beach, part of Los Angeles, where it's popular, and they're using these kind of map-based interfaces to let citizens say, I'd like a park here, we should fix this pothole, and then they all deliberate around it and move around these pots of money. But in New York City, I think the example is particularly instructive, because the government layer there, called the councilors, city councilors, didn't have the shiniest reputation. Right? It's kind of, back in the past, a little bit more likely to be allied with organized crime, a little bit more, just a little bit more corrupt, a little bit less dignified, say, than the position of mayor. About 5 years ago, 4 city councilors in New York decided that they would run little participatory budgeting initiatives. And within 4 years, more than half of that governance layer are now running participatory budgeting initiatives. There's plenty of people who would say that in a council where that has started, you're pretty much unelectable if you try to roll that back. If you and your neighbors have been directing the public money and then some new political leader proposes himself for leadership and says, trust me, I will just do it, the way that you want me to. A group of people aren't going to go back to that who have achieved the literacy that comes from experiencing democracy that they put their hands on that's correlated to a pocketbook and real-world outcomes. And it doesn't have to be at a municipal level. It doesn't have to be within government for you to get your hands on it, for you to try it out. Your neighbors across the Tasman Sea, the Inspiral Collective in Wellington, helped to incubate and build Co-Budget, which is an open source co-budgeting application, participatory budgeting application, if you will, that you could run within your family, within your company, within your rugby club, within whatever organization you want. You set it up, you put your money in, and then it's got several years worth of experience trying to facilitate dialogue and exchange and consensus building so that everybody gets good at spending that money together. And I'm not doing the blockchain talk, so I'm not going to go into too much depth, but if you're wondering, do I really need to track blockchain and some of these things that are happening within it, this area of governance is why you do. Democracy Earth won Singularity University's Global Grand Challenge Governance Award the first year that we held it, and they're interested in bringing the smart contractability of blockchain, which means not just the trust. You might have heard blockchain is so trustworthy, but now it can be actionable. You can make an agreement, and then it can be executed by code. So you have another layer of confidence that what you've said, where you've said the money will go, where you've said the resources will be allocated, can be followed through. So they're working with that. It's also kind of plug and play for lots of different types of organizations, not just governments. And I wanted to give a shout out to MyVote as well in this context of governance, because they're an Aussie company really making a name for themselves in the world by trying to address the particular problem that comes from a misled population, populists and fake news in general. Sometimes because there are places where misinformation and populism leads to a terrible president, people start to doubt democracy. And so these guys have they're trying to set up a really good, almost like a filtration system that says if you're about to vote on an amendment or a piece of policy, it might ask you, okay, if you vote for this, is it true that we will close all of the churches in New South Wales? And if they're like, yes, that's what this is all about, and it isn't, then it's like, wait a second, and it takes them over, and it's like, here's where you might have got that information, here's the actual piece of policy, here's what the ramification is, and it quizzes the person until they get to a point that they understand the ramifications, and then they can vote on them. Now, there's lots of ways that could be abused. It frightens me how many ways that could be abused, but in the right hands and with the right kind of neutral body overseeing it, the right number of academies and external oversight, it could become a way that we scrub some of the more pernicious effects of fake news from our democracies. And if the things I'm talking to you about generally seem kind of fringe, or if you doubt they'll really work in your ecosystem, or you think they're kind of small, you're not following the money. And I don't blame you if you're not. Almost nobody that I've talked to is following the money in this regard. The digital development principles behind me are fairly new, but they already have 100 signatories to them, more. And these are signatories who are in charge of tens of billions of dollars. The World Bank Group, all of it, UNICEF, USAID, all the US government's foreign giving, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and then a host of consulting arms, Sweden's giving, all of them have said, we will only fund things if they follow these rules. And some of these rules are pretty toothless, right? Design with the user. Oh, okay, check, I did that. I surveyed the user. Or be collaborative. Yeah, I feel pretty collaborative. But number 6 is really hard to fake. If you're developing with open data, open innovation, open source, everybody gets to benefit from what you did. And that's the idea. They're saying this is public money. This is money that's supposed to benefit everybody. So after we give it to you, you should give the result back to us. People should be allowed to copy and paste your solution around the world quickly so that it works. One of the ways that we see this already happening is UNICEF also created an innovation fund. A lot of people a little while ago would have been super surprised to see that happening. You would also be surprised to know that they had to quickly cap donations to this fund. People were lining up at $10 million. They're like, okay, that's enough for us for now. And then the people are kind of in the wings waiting, and they're not even waiting to get returns or profit from what they're doing. They're waiting to invest in companies that promise to put their solution into the Creative Commons and onto GitHub and into open source. That's what they want to be involved with. It's a new kind of patronage. It's like building public works digitally for UNICEF that has their imprimatur that can then spread around that entire ecosystem. I like that this headline was in 2016. I like it because a lot of times I talk to more executive audiences who can be kind of snooty about international aid and development. They're like, they haven't really done anything, they haven't solved any of these problems, they're not really innovative. UNICEF literally has a portfolio of blockchain companies in emerging frontier economies. How many of your C-suite executives even fully understand what it is? This is not where you would have expected to see this leadership coming 10 years ago. But it is where some of this technology is most relevant. They're using blockchain with Amply to track service delivery for early childhood development, keeping impeccable records and improving the quality of the experience of that child, like through a state. They're also working on facial recognition technology to spot, like just algorithmically from your face, whether you're suffering as a child from malnutrition. And they're setting a leading example of how to protect that data and keep it private so that it doesn't disgrace or damage the reputation of that child later on down the line. Another one of the tailwinds that's pushing forward some of the things that I'm talking to you about is what the Creative Commons Foundation is doing. Those are 2 Twitter handles you can follow if you want to see like what they're targeting and how they're moving. Why should you pay attention to them? Because they have victories like this. The Department of Labor in the United States has a $2 billion annual budget for the 700-plus community colleges that it represents and that it serves. Previously, that was a lovely, fat bunch of government money that could go to the same small group of private corporations year after year to make minor adjustments to the textbook and charge a little bit more each time. Huge waste. Really inefficient, profitable for a small number of people. Now, everything that's developed has to go into the Creative Commons, where all of the people that teach it, all of the people that study it, can work with it and improve it, as you could on Wikipedia. And the government doesn't have to spend the same money just getting V8, V9 of a textbook, so their money can go further. Bulgaria had an interesting victory for the Creative Commons in this regard too. They created an Electronic Governance Act that said every piece of software engineered for the government of Bulgaria would have to be developed in open source, in a public open repository. Imagine what that does for the opportunities of like graft and corruption. Right? You can't just be like, yeah, my cousin's got a company, they're really great, and then you get a contract and you suck at it and it's inefficient. It's really hard to do that now if you're in Bulgaria, if you're working with educational materials in the Department of Labor. And these are the same kind of things that they set a precedent. They change the literacy in the room. If you've been in one organization or one place and you've benefited from this, and then you come into some new setting and they're like, no, that's not how we work. We don't have open tenders. We don't do that. A lot of people won't even go and they won't make that move professionally, personally, because they're like, this is an old, corrupt, bad, broken system that you're operating. This is how it's going to be operating, and we insist on this. I would be remiss if I didn't mention another kind of tailwind to the commons and to this building these new models of ownership design, if I didn't give a nod to the movement that gained a lot of steam in New Zealand to give legal personhood to natural bodies. So Ecuador did it first, New Zealand did it second. They gave it to a river, then to a forest. They're working on giving it to a mountain. But this isn't like a mythical, this isn't like an honorary doctorate, right? That you're like, oh, look, we now think it's a person. If you studied kind of the development of companies, you know that when companies were given legal personhood, that was a huge deal. Instead of having corporate charters that could be revoked by the state or by like the people around the company became a person. But the company doesn't die. So the company's eternal. It's amassing power and influence as it moves around the world. That's a big part of what was going on with globalization. Some of the imbalances that have come about by that could potentially be redressed by this idea of giving legal personhood to natural bodies. And it wasn't just a trend in New Zealand. It took off, and it's starting to happen in India, where they were giving legal personhood to lakes, to glaciers, to rivers. Bolivia's looking into it. Pittsburgh, a city in the United States that I never would have thought would do this, Pittsburgh's looking into it. Santa Monica. And now there's a company coming out of New Zealand that's setting itself up to facilitate and accelerate this trend. And they're building on it in a way that I think is really nice. So it's all fair and well. Let's say that you had, as Australia, imagine, what would have happened if you had given the Great Barrier Reef legal personhood some time ago? Then people start messing it up. What you can do when people are damaging a legal person is you can take them to court. Because now nature is being tracked. And not just by like how much is it worth in dollars. We're not doing that game anymore. Oh, that tree's worth $40,000, so there's economic harm. No, it's a person. You're hurting a person. The law protects people. So it's a lot harder for you to pollute and destroy the things that should be around for 7, 20, 100 generations after you're dead. Uterra wants you to take a natural body and put it on your board. That's now a type of leadership that you can demonstrate. Say you have a board and your company has always benefited a lot from a water table,
or your headquarters have always been next to like a really stunning piece of your country. You can now say, you can work with people to create a legal person entity around that, and you can put it on your board. You could put dividends towards it. You could create a structure that enabled that entity with the profit that you're recognizing that it probably contributed to you in the first place, that enable it to grow, to look after itself, to become stronger. There's so much that can be done with this. Everything, all the innovation that you saw in terms of corporate structure is just about to be opened up to all of us to do with natural bodies that interest us, that we want to protect for grandchildren or for whatever. Right? That's kind of remarkable. And so I've been toying with this idea that these questions are all kind of the same. So how does your innovation bring glory to Zeus? How does it advance the nation of Yugoslavia? And how does your innovation guarantee monetary returns? At first you might look at these and be like, oh, those first two are really silly. Zeus doesn't exist, Yugoslavia doesn't really either. But all of these are basically single variable lenses that reinforce a dominant localized paradigm, and they lead to bad design. They're not complex, they're not systematic, they don't anticipate or make good use of everything's an externality if you're just looking down this one little lane. This is not the pinnacle of our thinking. This is not the end of economic or political thought. In fact, I would go a step further and I would say that it is a form of censorship. If you bully change makers and innovators by making them prove to you how they can self-sustain and grow financially, if that's what you put them through first, you are censoring our ability to be creative, communal, and collaborative right when we most need to do that. And I would encourage you, if you have the comfort, the privilege, the power to maybe back off on that a little bit and try investing in some of the people that are running these experiments with ownership design, you are making a very timely and helpful for humanity, for the planet, investment of what you found yourself having. I like that Kyla showed you this graph, and I'm also going to kind of land a little bit in the impossibility of comprehending when exponentials go vertical. And the thing that I think drives it home for some people, especially people in a more traditional corporate setting, is watching the shrinking lifespan of companies all around the world really today, but this is a good example. The S&P 500 is the 500 biggest companies publicly traded in the United States. It used to be that once you became one of those companies, you were going to enjoy 67 years of pulling in profits. It's like a dynasty, multiple generations. You had that much time to enjoy it. This quote came out in 2012. By that point, it was already down to 15 years. Now it's down just under 12 at last count. This is one of these kind of reversed, flipped exponential curves. And nobody that I know has said, oh yeah, but this trend's going the other direction. Now, this is temporary. This is correlated with this incredible advance in technology that we have. There are companies falling off the S&P 500 every 2 weeks. So why would I end on this note? Well, because if you are fortunate enough to have a company, to have resources, or even to bump into a change maker or an innovator who has a good idea, if you have something that's relevant right now in your hands, that's amazing. That is so fortunate. Obviously, most people don't have that. If you have that and then you think, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to build myself like an empire out of this. And how would I do that? Okay, I got to really consolidate in Australia. We'll work on that for 2-3 years. Maybe we'll jump the pond. We'll get over to New Zealand, maybe the Philippines at the same time. We'll kind of try to maintain all our power and control as we get over there. Say that takes you 6 or 7 years, and then you have maybe 3, and then you're irrelevant. Right? Like, it doesn't make as much sense to do that anymore. And the likelihood that it stayed relevant even for 3 or 4 or 5 years is getting less and less and less and less, which means you should be thinking that this is more and more of a treasure that you have, and that the best thing you can do with it is share it laterally, horizontally, copy and paste that everywhere, so that the thing that you had in your hands that might have been useful to people goes everywhere that it needs to be. Because this is what results when you don't do that, right? This is the city that Empire built. And we don't need a whole bunch more moonshot soloists. We need to be a moonshot species. Thank you very much.